Chicago sent some politicians as well. The reason I separate those guys is because those guys were not stand-up citizens, not good guys all around. Everybody else sent their best politicians. Chicago sent their worst, their most corrupt, their most aggressive, and the best guys for the job. Now, they were so aggressive in D.C., they would pull people into offices, corner them into bathrooms, just talking the ear off of Washington about why we deserve to host the fair. They also bolstered the city too much, lying about it, stretching the truth, to where the other D.C. politicians started calling the Chicago ones windbags for blowing hot air all around Washington. The reason I mention this aggressive tactic worked. We did win the right to host the World's Fair, but it annoyed a lot of people. It annoyed so many people that a New York reporter put in his story after we won the fair, "I cannot believe they gave the World's Fair to those windy windbags from that windy city blowing nothing but hot air." Fun fact about that article, it was the first use of the nickname the Windy City, and here's the real kicker, we're the 50th windiest city in the United States. 50, not 15th, 50th. Amarillo, Texas is number 1 if you're curious. But we are not called the Windy City for wind velocity, we're called that for our corrupt politicians blowing hot air in the 1890s. Score 2, Chicago. Now, we did win the right to host the World's Fair though, excellent, wonderful, but we were expecting a lot of people in this World's Fair. We were originally expecting 22 million, we ended up getting 27 million. That's a lot, especially considering the fact the U.S. population at the time was 60 million, so nearly half the U.S. was coming to our city, so we put a really smart guy in charge. The architect's named Daniel Burnham. Now, Daniel Burnham said, how am I going to fit all these people in my city? I'm going to build a city inside of my city. That's what he did. Further down south in Jackson Park, he built this city inside of a city out of staff. Staff is a very cheap and easy to build building material, and he painted every building inside of the city the same color, white. He also gave it a very creative name. I don't know what the fairgrounds were called. The White City, yes. Now, another big task that Daniel Burnham had ahead of him is how am I going to light the White City? I'm not going to use candles for an obvious reason. Well, lucky for him, an inventor by the name of Thomas Edison had invented this nifty new thing called a light bulb. That made its major debut at the World's Fair of 1893 as the main lighting source of the fairgrounds. Now, that's not the only invention that made its debut at that World's Fair. The world's first moving walkway, which you see in airports, that made its debut. Also, the Pledge of Allegiance made its debut by a group of school children uttering that. If you don't know what that is, school children in America, they just say that every year at the start of school, or sorry, not every year, every day at the beginning of school, at the beginning of the school day. And actually, school started mostly in America today, so that actually happened a lot. Now, also, yoga made its introduction to the United States that year. Now, my favorite things to talk about that were introduced at that World's Fair are the food items: juicy fruit gum, fried ice cream, Vienna sausages, the world's first Vienna beef hot dog. Also, Pabst Blue Ribbon beer won its titular blue ribbon at that fair. Fun fact about that blue ribbon, it was a participation prize. And I know you're thinking, if you have ever tried PBR, that makes sense. It is definitely a beer. It does exist. Now, also, Milton Hershey of Hershey Caramel Company had been working on a milk chocolate recipe that he debuted at the World's Fair, turning into Hershey Chocolate Company. But the biggest invention at that World's Fair, the actual physically biggest, was probably the main attraction. Now, the main attraction to Paris' World's Fair, that was the Eiffel Tower, of course, designed by Gustave Eiffel. Now, Gustave offered Daniel Burnham to design a second Eiffel Tower, twice the size of the one in Paris in Jackson Park. Daniel Burnham said no. He wanted an American to design the main attraction. Lucky for him, an American by the name of George Washington Ferris had just developed the new amusement ride called, you want to guess what it's called? The Ferris wheel, yes. Now, that Ferris wheel, it was 262 feet tall. It's about 60 feet taller than the one you'll see at Navy Pier, and it could hold over 1,000 people at a time. It no longer stands, that's probably for the best. You would not want to ride the world's first Ferris wheel. Each train car was exactly that, a recycled train car that they packed full with about 100 people at a time. It took 1 hour to do one revolution around the Ferris wheel, and of course, it being 1893, those train cars weren't air-conditioned, so pretty rough conditions at that main attraction. It actually cost the same amount of money to enter the Ferris wheel as it did to enter the World's Fair. So yes, that's the World Fair of 1893. Now let's talk about what we're approaching right here on the left-hand side. Now, this is actually a park. It is called Ping Tom Park. It is where Chinatown is in Chicago. Highly recommend a visit to our Chinatown. I think ours is one of the best in the country. Great food, great shopping can get done there. Now, the park itself, it is called Ping Tom Park. Now, Ping Tom, he was very active in Chicago during the 70s and 80s. He was a Chinese civic leader. And he lobbied for years for a park to be built because whenever the interstate got put in through Chicago, it destroyed all the park systems of Chinatown. Ping Tom did not like this, so he lobbied for years to get one built. Unfortunately, he never got to see it done. It had been approved but he had not got to see it done. He had passed away before this building, or before the park was completed in 1991. He is immortalized inside the park, though. On the left-hand side, you'll see this pagoda with the orange columns. That's what the structure is called. Right next to that pagoda, you're going to see a bust of a man's head. That statue of that man's head, that is of Ping Tom. Now, Ping Tom is not the only one paid tribute to in Ping Tom Park. If you were to walk around this park, which I do recommend, it's beautifully designed, you're going to see a lot of references to trains and railroads. This is a tribute to the Chinese immigrants that essentially built the entirety of the North American rail system. Now, speaking of rail systems, directly in front of the boat right now, you're going to see a bridge. Let's talk about it. Now, this bridge was built in 1914. It's a vertical lift bridge, and it's also one of the oldest vertical lift bridges in the world. It was built in 1914. It's over 100 years old, and it's still fully mechanically functioning. Now, of course, trains still go across the bridge all the time. The Amtrak and the Metro uses that, but also this bridge still lifts. It still lifts directly upward over 50 feet in the air using a very rudimentary counterweight system. I always like to point out the counterweights. The giant concrete slabs on the top of the two side towers there, those are the counterweights. Those move downward, pulling the center of the bridge up, making it so that bridge only runs on a 100 horsepower motor. That is all it needs. Now, I have talked about the fort, I have talked about the fire, I have talked about the fair. There is one more thing I need to talk about, but I know what it is. Fair. Yes, there's another fair. Yeah, people are listening. There was another World's Fair, Century of Progress, 1933, happened during the Great Depression. Now, the big message of that World's Fair was if we as a country are going to get out of this financial hardship, the Great Depression that we're in, we need to focus on science, technology, and innovation. That's all what that World's Fair was about. Now, a few interesting exhibits that focused on science and technology. The General Motors Company, they were tasked with setting up an assembly line. You can actually watch people build cars and motors live. That is something that you could go there at the World's Fair. On the medical science front of things, another thing you can watch live, a little bit more bizarre, premature babies being incubated in incubation chambers, being cared for by doctors and nurses. You can actually watch this happen in a large room, showing off the new technology of premature infant incubation. We might get to see a train go across the bridge now as well. Now, also, the World's Fair's first Home of Tomorrow exhibits, 4 model homes featuring all this futuristic technology were inside. That's very popular in subsequent World's Fairs. We definitely are going to get to see a train. Maybe if he'll do this, they'll really lay on the horn. It's happening. As I said, Amtrak Metro, use it all the time. Seeing this exciting, getting to see a bridge in action, folks. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. Now, the few interesting introductions at that World's Fair. Now, before I get to that, though, where that World's Fair took place in 1933, it did not take place in Jackson Park in the White City. That no longer stood. It took place on the lakefront, close to the museum campus, Grant Park and Millennium Park, that whole area. It actually took place in the opposite of the White City. That area was called the Rainbow City. Every building was painted with a different color, and they had a more modern design to them, because the whole focus of that World's Fair was modernization. Now, a few introductions at that World's Fair that I'd like to mention. I'll tell you my least favorite thing that was introduced at that World's Fair. Kraft Foods did that to us. Miracle Whip. Miracle Whip made its debut at the World's Fair of 1933. That was my least favorite thing. The L line got added on to because the World's Fair was a lot more spread out than the other World's Fair. The L line got added on to, becoming a more complete transit system of the city. Now the third rail also got introduced, the thing that powers most electric train systems in major American cities. So I told you my least favorite. Now I'm going to tell you my favorite thing that was introduced at that World's Fair. Now my favorite thing that was introduced was not a thing. It was not an invention. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an invention. It wasn't a product. It was a person. Judy Garland. Judy Garland made her concert singing debut at that World's Fair, her first public appearance. If you don't know who that is, 6 years after that, in 1939, Judy Garland went on to star as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. So one of the most iconic movie stars of all time made her concert singing debut at the World's Fair of 1933. So folks, that's the fort, the fire, the fair, and the fair. And now I'm going to stop talking for about 5 to 10 minutes as we're heading back down the South Branch of the river. During this time, feel free, meander about the boat, visit the bar downstairs. Also during this time, if you have any questions, now is not my break. Absolutely, feel free to come and ask. I'll be right here. You know, what's that building? What's your favorite color? What's the meaning of life? If it's any of those, that building is the Willis Tower. My favorite color is purple, and the meaning of life is 42. But if you have any other ones, I'll be right here. Absolutely, feel free to come and ask. I'll get back on the mic as I close to the downtown area. Thank you guys, and enjoy the cruise portion of your tour.
No, es súper. Ahí le pagan por eso.
Qué bonito.